Okay, hi Dea, and welcome to the 36th Independent Film Fest Osnabrück. We're excited to show your film Wake Up on Mars in our Children's Rights Program, which also means that it's part of the competition around the prize that is awarded by our youth jury. So welcome. And I would like to jump right in and start where I assume you started as well with your film project. So how did you first come across the so-called Resignation syndrome, and what inspired you to make a documentary film about it?
So I came across it like quite randomly. I think it was I usually I'm an avid reader of the New Yorker magazine, and so I was just reading the magazine, and I kind of fell upon this article that was called "The Trauma of Facing Deportation," and that was an American journalist, Rachel Aviv, who had gone to Sweden for a few weeks and had met with families whose children had been in a coma or in an apathetic state for months or years. And it was really shocking because it was mostly children who were asylum seekers and families who were asylum seekers. And they got into this state after learning that they were going to be deported from Sweden. And so for me, it was kind of like a sort of like a very much a triggering moment where I just felt that I felt completely overwhelmed by the topic and quite connected in a way, because one of the families whose testimonial was in the article was the Demiri family that you see in the film. And they're from Kosovo, and I'm also from Kosovo. So for me, it was kind of like, I felt like there was a connection there. And I could really, I just wanted to reach out. I think first, I really wanted to talk to them. And so I first contacted Elizabeth Hultkrantz that you see in the film, who's the doctor. And then after a lot of back and forth, she told me that I could come to Sweden to meet a few families. And then she introduced me to a few families, and amongst them was the Demiri family. And I think that when we met, the connection was very, very strong quite right away, and a lot of trust and a lot of like cultural references that we had in common, I think allowed me to think about making a feature film about them, and so this is kind of how it started.
Do you remember what specific shared cultural aspects you recognized in each other?
Yeah, I think for me, obviously, there was the Albanian language. So I speak Albanian also. And I think for them, it was very important to be able to communicate in Albanian, because they had been in Sweden for quite a while. And the father was learning Swedish, but it was still very difficult for him to, really explain what was going on and what had been going on with his family in Swedish. And so they felt like very isolated. And I think right away to communicate in Albanian was very important. And also my family has lived through the war. They're Roma from Kosovo, so they lived through the war and also the persecution that came afterwards against the Roma communities. So I think in that sense, like what was interesting was that we didn't have to explain to each other much, like they knew, like we had the same references. And like, I think sometimes it's good that people don't feel like they have to justify themselves to you, because kind of like the background and the context they come from. And they always had to justify themselves in all the other situations they were in. And in that situation, we could talk more about how they felt in Sweden, what was their dream, what was their hope, what were they hopeful for their children, and also the anxiety for them of like not understanding the current system in Sweden.
And still, even if you have this shared language and the shared cultural background, you were entering a deeply, deeply personal space, which is their home, where they spend so much time. So how did you approach that? Did you first come alone, or?
So I first came alone, of course. I mean, I had like spoken to a fixer and a DP before coming. And so I told them to kind of stay put in Stockholm, and that I would tell them if they could come along before. But when I first met the family, I stayed for 3 days alone with them and with Elizabeth. So I would come back like kind of every day to kind of see them. And then I got the crew to come. So we stayed overall for 10 days, and it was just a few shots here and there. So we didn't shoot a lot. It was just a few interviews, and think, spending time, especially with Rasul and Furkan. And I spent a lot of time with them, in their neighborhood. They were showing me like the forest nearby where they used to play, where they played football and stuff, and also kind of understanding the sort of also the imaginary world that Furkan, kind of like has. And I think that was one of the main inspiration after this first location scouting trip. When I came out of it, I just thought that he had such a rich imagination, and they were so fascinated by space, like both of them, and especially Furkan, but in a way that you felt like it was more like a child trying to escape his reality and constructing another reality. And I felt like it was very sort of mirroring, like a parallel to what his sisters were doing, with sort of like, being in a coma, like to be protected. It was his way to protect himself. And so I thought that I really wanted to integrate that visually and metaphorically in the film. And so that would allow me for Furkan to participate more in the making of the film, to have more agency in the way that he was portrayed in the film, and that he was a creator in the film too.
Yeah, I think that becomes pretty obvious, but also I think in him you could see this deep sense of empathy that he has with his sisters. You just see that there's a really deep connection. So was this empathy something that was quite obvious to you from the beginning, or that you found out through spending time with him? And generally, as an adult, you know what the family has been through, so you know that there's so much trauma behind it. What was your experience like in approaching childhood trauma, or working with childhood trauma in that sense?
I think the way I also, I think I was conscious that I could make the film with this family in particular, because they had built so much resilience that was based on the love that they had for each other. So I think for me, I saw like the foundation of their family as very strong, and the foundation of their family is really like the parents, the way they love their children, the way they give them affection, the way they're patient with their children, the way they're very understanding. And that, I think that cocoon was so safe that I felt like I could be in that space without creating trouble, that like they were strong enough, that love was strong enough for that. And I think that's with Furkan, what was the most touching really was that there was obviously this love and affection for his sisters, but he had known his sisters for a very long time, like they fell into a coma when he was like 4 or 5. So there was also this idea that he was attaching himself to like small souvenirs and memories that he had with them, and I think it felt more like dreams of his sisters for him. And there's a lot of moments where he would just stay in the room with them, that he would talk to them, that he would sometimes sleep with them. Like there was really like this connection. And what was, I think, really hard for me was really thinking that it's a child who's like deeply traumatized, who has a lot of feelings of guilt about what has happened to his sisters. And so how to navigate that,
Now we're approaching this space and Mars metaphor a little, because in Furkan, in the film, we see the duality between being so hopeful and almost relaxed at times, especially when he's a kid at the junkyard, which must be one of the happiest places as a child. But then there's also this deeply rooted concern in his eyes on the other side. So how did the whole metaphor come about, with which you managed to sort of externalize for us in the cinema what was so internalized in Furkan?
I think it was a sort of methodology that I had like overall in the film, that I kind of wanted people to feel that this space they inhabited in Sweden was kind of strange, that was kind of fantastical in a way, because it's a land where you have children, falling into a coma, like, falling into this like deep sleep. It's like something that you kind of over here in like it's kind of like a tale of the Sleeping Beauties or like of Snow White or something like that. And I think there was something that I wanted, like every single detail of the film to kind of always remind us of this alternative reality, this kind of magical reality we were in, be it positive and hopeful, but also negative, you know. And I think with Furkan, he gave me this like impulse for, you know, this notion of space. And so you find space in every single, like in a lot of elements of the film, like, you know, even the big white shots that we have of Sweden, where it kind of feels like this alien world, you know, that's like kind of beautiful, but also hostile. It's like a feeling that refugees also have in those small villages, where they're all in those tiny villages in Sweden, and like they're just surrounded by nature, so they feel disconnected also from the rest of society. So I think, yeah, it was kind of something that like you find, like what I say about the film is that it's kind of it's like making a clock, you know, like every single mechanical like element of it, every single thing is very intentional. In the editing, it's intentional. In the sound design, in the music, even in the color grading that we have, it's very intentional for us to really enter a specific universe and to stay inside that universe throughout. So then also I wanted the audience to trust me, to take them somewhere that would be in a realm that they know they're in a kind of in a documentary, but that, you know, I'm also taking them to a higher level. And this is why I also wanted to have this big launch of the spaceship, because for me it was this like materializing the feeling of hope that Furkan had, that, you know, and that we had for him too, and for his sisters, that we wanted them to wake up. So I wanted to kind of materialize this like element through the spaceship too.
You almost answered my next question, because I think in that scene where, well, at the end, you really show what documentary films are capable of, so far from any strict generic boundaries where, you know, fact or story and fiction blur so much. So maybe you could still talk a little bit about how the idea for the scene evolved, because it looks like such a massive cinematic moment.
Yeah. I mean, from the beginning, it was supposed to be a big scene. And even like in the treatment that I wrote before, you know, when we had to find funding and stuff for the film, there was so many elements of it that were really like science fiction-y, like really that I wanted to go quite far in different things. But I think that in the process of finding, because obviously there's the idea of something that you're right, and then obviously the reality of where Furkan lives. And I didn't want anything to be non-organic in the film. Like anything that was more like a fantastical element had to come from like the place where Furkan was, you know, like everything, it wasn't something that could be brought from outside. And so that was the idea with the junkyard that was next to his house, with the mechanics that were like also helping like next to his house, with the stuff that he was, you know, finding. It was really things that we really found on location. And so even when we had artists who came from Paris to help us with like building the spaceship, like the spaceship was made with just like recycled material that were there, like that were in the community, with people in the community. The spaceship was built, I mean, even the ramp, the launch ramp, it's a skateboard ramp that we found at a neighbor's house of like Furkan, you know, and that we asked them, can we take it? And so I think all these, this was the way I allowed myself to think, okay, we're doing this science fiction thing, but it has a purpose in the community where we're making it, for the story, for Furkan, for us also as a group, as a crew, that we work together to make this happen. And that was like the main experience, I guess, like to really make it in that way, and to ensure that Furkan always had agency over it, you know. So
yeah, and you already touched upon this, but such an important aspect is that in the end of the film, or your whole shooting process, this spaceship, or the building of the spaceship, became an actual reality for him. And then even on a more meta level, after, I guess, you put the whole thing through post-production, there's this actual scene of him going into space, and I can only imagine his reaction upon seeing that final scene fully edited.
Yeah, that was so crazy.
Oh, I bet. And so maybe more generally, because I think you have some really great techniques there that you showed. So what do you think can film do in terms of like making a differences in the lives we see in the pictures? And do you have any ideas or thoughts about making filmmaking more socially sustainable in a way?
So I think what I think now, and it's really a conversation that's been happening in documentary film, I think for the past 2 years or something, and I'm very for that. I think it's very important, is that the process of making the film needs to be as beneficial to the participants and the characters than for us to have the film being made at the end, that the process is as important as the film result at the end. Because I know that with a film like this, I can go to festivals, it can help my career, it can help like so many things. Like, you know, I'm also building my own momentum as a filmmaker from films like this. And you cannot just extract stories without having, you know, without understanding like the process of making. It's not enough now to say, I'm giving a voice to the voiceless, or I need to tell this story. You don't need to tell this story. Like, people don't need to, like, that's not how it should work. Because often what happens is that you ask someone, you know, to tell their story, and it could be a really traumatic story, and then you encapsulate it and you live with it, but people stay with their trauma, and they stay with like the, you know, they might be re-traumatized from talking about it, but there's no follow-up, there's no therapy, there's nothing, you know. It's not for them to give us a lesson about humanity only. So really, when I think about like my next films and the process of making the film, I'm like, what does it bring to my participant? How does it build their confidence? How does it bring their dignity? How can I help them in a more material way, like with legal support, with partnerships with certain organizations, with making sure that during the process of making the film, I spend time with my characters outside of filming, you know, that we actually do activities together. I think all of these elements are really like, we need to deconstruct this idea of like, I'm an observer from outside and I come and I like, that doesn't, I mean, that's unfair actually. Like, this is where you kind of like, you take this idea that, you know, you dominate the situation, and you shouldn't dominate the situation like this. You should really try to be as much as the same level as you can with your characters. And understanding their needs also during the making of the documentary.
Are you still in touch with the Demiri family, and how are they doing today? And did Ibadeta and Djeneta fully recover? And maybe you can talk or update us a little bit on that.
Absolutely. So the Demiri family is still in touch with them. I'm in touch with them quite often, actually, for just to get an update on how they are, and also sometimes for just different legal things. Because since I finished the film, it was kind of up and down for them with the asylum request. First, they had a temporary residency that we see in the film, and then a second temporary. So the third time we thought they would get permanent. That's sort of how it works in Sweden. But the pandemic happened, and then the father had a job in a restaurant, and then they received a letter saying that their asylum was denied because they thought that the father would lose his job because of the pandemic. And that was so, I mean, unexpected. That was last year in November. Really, we didn't think it would happen. We thought that, you know, they could have stayed, and so there was a deportation order. Like, everything went so fast, and so it get quite stressful for the Demiri family. And so what we did is that they have an amazing lawyer that like just reapplied right away for a whole new asylum. And then we were kind of scared, because the problem is with the whole new asylum, you need to have new grounds for your case, but they didn't have new grounds because they were in Sweden for so many years. And so we didn't really know what would happen. And finally, actually, 6 months ago, they got again a temporary residency permit for 13 months. And this summer, I found out, like, the father told me that actually his lawyer told him that because they've been in Sweden now for so many years, actually, like, their status is different, so they most likely will be able to stay in Sweden. So fingers crossed. That's kind of what we're hoping. And then for Ibadeta and Djeneta, like Ibadeta, who's been in a coma for 3.5 years, is doing pretty well, actually. When she woke up, she remembered both Albanian and Swedish, and started walking after 6 months, and then talking and stuff. So really, her rehabilitation has been going very well, actually. For Djeneta, it's a bit slower because she's been in the coma for much longer, and I think there's elements of how can I say, like, mental health that she hasn't really, that she's still dealing with, I guess. But both of them want to continue their studies. They want to become nurses. Rasul wants to become an airline pilot. Furkan doesn't really know, but maybe an actor. So, you know,
should maybe think about some engineer.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe I think it would be more like Rasul, who would become he's very good at maths, and so but yeah, so there's so much hope and, you know, opportunities if they're left, you know, if the Swedish government accepts to keep them in Sweden. So that's the main thing.
Okay, I think we can all agree that we're all having our fingers crossed and remain very hopeful. And Dea, thank you so much for taking the time for us today, and good luck with the distribution of the film. And I hope many, many people will get to see it and get to talk about it. And yeah, I wish you a good rest of the festival.
Yeah, and thank you to the audience of Osnabrück. I regret not to be there. I would have loved to attend the festival, but unlikely. It's really like now I have like a few coming up, just one after the other. But thank you so much for the questions and for the Q&A and for showing my film.